The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It fell in thin, steady curtains that blurred the hedgerows into green walls of vapour and mud. Colonel Robert T. McLeod stepped off the back of a GMC truck at Street, Sauveur-le-Vicomte, and looked out over what his orders called a forward air control point. In truth, it was a barn half collapsed under shellfire, its roof patched with tarps and Red Cross flags. Somewhere beyond the hedges, American armour idled uselessly, engines coughing in the damp air. He was 42 years old, short, sandy-haired, a career cartographer turned staff officer in the IX Tactical Air Command. His job, at least on paper, was to synchronize airstrikes with the slow grind of the U.S. First Army pushing inland from Utah Beach. But the system wasn't working. Tanks were stalled in the bocage. Air missions were bombing the wrong orchards. And every evening, the casualty lists lengthened with the same terse explanation. Target unconfirmed due to terrain obstruction. At 0930 hours, McLeod ducked under a poncho roof into the operations tent. Major Darnell, a field artillery liaison, was shouting over the static of a radio set. "Can't you see it? There's a hedgerow every 10 damn yards. The maps show open fields." The major's finger stabbed a damp sheet of paper pinned to a crate. It was an official G.S. 4,250 series map 1, 25,000 scale, printed in London from pre-war Michelin road charts. Roads, towns, and rivers were marked in perfect British precision. But between them lay blank space, pale green where hundreds of small hedges, lanes, and ditches should have been. McLeod bent closer. "You're saying they can't see the targets? See them? Hell, they can't even find them. 2 squadrons of Thunderbolts dropped short yesterday, wiped out an entire platoon of the 83rd. The colonel said nothing. He ran a finger along the contour lines broad. Lazy curves smoothed to fit peacetime cartography. Each one was an approximation, and he knew it. The Allied maps of Normandy were, by G2, Directive, compiled from outdated French survey sheets and aerial photos taken at 10,000 feet. They lacked the microscopic relief of the bocage, the sunken lanes, the drainage ditches, the 2-meter banks that turned every field into a miniature fortress. He remembered an offhand remark from an RAF reconnaissance officer weeks earlier. The Germans mapped every cow path in France before the war. That afternoon, McLeod walked to the ruined Mairie, the town hall, where prisoners from the 243rd Infantry Division had been processed. In a side room, among crates of captured documents, he found what he hadn't dared to hope for. Bound atlases stamped Heeresvermessungsamt, Berlin 1938, German military cadastral surveys. Each sheet was a marvel-precise grid overlays down to individual farm boundaries, elevation marks at 1-meter intervals, and the tiny cross symbols of culverts and walls. "Where'd these come from?" he asked the corporal guarding the pile. "From a truck we hit near La Haye du Puits. Thought they were propaganda leaflets." McLeod opened one sheet under the light of a flickering lantern. Saint-Lô lay at the centre like a spider's web of narrow fields. The hedgerows were drawn as thick green veins, each annotated with the German word Wallhecke. In one corner, a note read, "For artillery survey use restricted." He knew immediately what it meant. With data like this, one could plot line of sight across the bocage, mark every rise and depression, and coordinate strikes within yards. But another memory intruded. Directive 42 from SHAEF intelligence issued only weeks before the invasion strictly forbade the use of captured enemy cartography. The reason was political and psychological. If Allied units relied on German maps, it might suggest the enemy's technical superiority. Still, McLeod folded one sheet carefully into his field case. "You never saw this, Corporal." That night, the barn hummed with the sound of generators and typewriters. Rain drummed on the canvas roof, while McLeod spread the German sheets beside RAF photo mosaics, long rolls of overlapping black and white prints. With a magnifier, he began aligning features, a farmhouse roof, a road junction, a church spire. He traced them onto onion skin paper with a draftsman's pencil, overlaying Allied grid coordinates. The first composite took him 3 hours. It showed a rectangle of terrain north of Saint-Fromont fields, bordered by thick banks, a drainage canal, and a single sunken road where Panzer Lehr Division was believed to be regrouping. He labelled it Test Overlay, a 1. When Major Darnell returned from the line, he found McLeod still bent over the lamp. "What the hell is that?" "Something the Germans did better than we did," McLeod said. "You're not supposed to use that stuff. G2 will hang you." "Only if they find out." The Major studied the translucent sheet. "If this is right, there's a hedge here that runs exactly along our artillery line. That could be why the pilots keep overshooting." McLeod looked up. "Then tomorrow, let's prove it." At dawn, 2 P-47 Thunderbolts from the 406th Fighter Group lifted off from a forward strip near Crickerville. Each pilot carried a copy of McLeod's overlay folded under his knee pad. The target was a suspected tank column near La Denicière. For once, the sky was clear. At 0742 hours, radio operators at IX-TAC recorded the transmission. Able 2 to control, visual on target per overlay. A12 runs direct hits, tanks burning. McLeod listened over the crackle of static. Heart-hammering. 30 minutes later, reconnaissance photos confirmed it. 2 Panzer IVs destroyed, 1 immobilized half in a ditch, within 20 yards of the plotted coordinates. By evening, word spread through the squadron mess tents. Pilots called them ghost maps. Someone joked that McLeod was practicing witchcraft with enemy charts. He didn't deny it. But success carried its own noise. On June 20, a courier from IX Air Service Command arrived with a typed memorandum. Subject: Unauthorized cartographic material. IX-TAC from G2. First Army all-field units are reminded that use of captured German maps or aerial photographs is prohibited under Directive 42. Offending personnel will be subject to court-martial. McLeod read it twice. Then he folded it neatly and slipped it into the same folder as the overlays. The rain had started again outside. That night, he wrote in his field notebook, June 18 to 20. The maps are too good to ignore. Terrain like this kills men faster than bullets. If I have to break a rule to fix it, so be it. There's no law in a hedgerow. He blew out the lantern, leaving the barn in darkness except for the faint luminescence of the damp paper. Somewhere outside, artillery thudded, dull, rhythmic, endless. McLeod lay back on his cot, the ghost maps stacked beside him, and thought of the fields of Saint-Lô, every hedge, every lane, every forbidden line he would soon redraw. He had crossed the line from regulation into rebellion, though not for glory. The war, he told himself, was already illegal enough. His map merely balanced the scales. The morning air in Normandy was thick with mist, and the scent of churned earth hung over the hedgerows like smoke. Colonel McLeod trudged along a narrow sunken lane outside Saint-Fromont, the overlay sheets tucked in a waterproof case under his arm. His boots sank into mud, and every few steps he had to climb over a toppled branch or sidestep a small crater. From the ridge above, he could hear the low rumble of M4 Shermans attempting to force their way through the bocage. Most were stuck, their tracks spinning uselessly in the wet soil. He stopped to confer with Lieutenant James Albright, a liaison officer from the 4th Infantry Division, whose map fold was a pristine, printed G2 copy. Albright shook his head. "They're in the wrong field again. Command said we'd cross here, but the tank platoon's pinned against a ditch we didn't even see on the map. Mortars can't adjust fast enough." McLeod pulled out his composite overlay, carefully unfolding it on a flat patch of ground. He traced the intended route with a pencil, noting every hedge and dip. "This is where the Sherman platoon should go," he said. "And see this small lane here?" He tapped a faint green line that ran between 2 thick hedgerows. "It's sunken, yes, but it's passable if they use it right. That's where we can punch through." Albright frowned. "This isn't in the official orders. You're going to get us court-martialed. Or get men killed if we don't act." McLeod said. His tone left no room for debate. By 1,000 hours, McLeod had convinced a small detachment of engineers and forward observers to trust his overlay. They followed him down the narrow lane, marking hedgerow gaps with chalk and smoke grenades. Every step forward was a negotiation with the terrain itself. Tanks bottomed in hidden ditches, engineers hacked through thorny banks, and infantry slogged through the mud alongside them. At 1037, a squadron of P-47 Thunderbolts roared overhead. The pilots had been briefed on McLeod's overlays rather than the official maps. For the first time since Utah Beach, air support hit with near-perfect precision. Explosions tore through German defensive positions, pillboxes, and field emplacements without hitting American troops. McLeod knelt in the mud and scribbled notes in his field notebook. Overlay accuracy confirmed. Hedgerow gaps correspond to pre-war cadastral lines. Artillery can now bracket targets within 20 meters. He glanced at the engineers directing tanks into the newly marked lanes. For the first time, the armored column moved with purpose instead of stalling blindly. The German defenders were quick to respond. By midday, mortars and machine gun fire swept the lanes. McLeod ducked behind a collapsed fence with Albright. The lieutenant winced as a shell burst a few meters away, throwing mud and splinters. "They see us!" Albright shouted over the roar. "Not us," McLeod corrected. "They see where they think we'll go. That's the beauty of this map, they can't anticipate the routes we've plotted through the hidden lanes. We move where they're blind." Using his overlay, he directed a platoon of engineers to set smoke screens and clear debris. Within the hour, the first Shermans breached the bocage barrier, following lanes he had plotted. Soldiers in the rear cheered. McLeod allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The invisible terrain that had been killing men for a week was now yielding under the guidance of forbidden maps. By late afternoon, McLeod joined Colonel Samuel Harkins of the 9th Armored Division at a forward command post. Harkins, a grizzled veteran with a reputation for stubborn adherence to protocol, eyed the overlays warily. "Colonel," Harkins said, folding his arms, "I hear you've been using German maps. That's a direct violation of G2 orders. You realize that?" McLeod met his gaze evenly. "Yes, sir. I also realize men are alive because we used them. The official maps don't show the bocage correctly. Tanks are getting stuck. Artillery is overshooting. Airstrikes are hitting the wrong orchards. We adapt, or we lose men." Harkins studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Get the infantry and armor through the lane you plotted, but I want regular updates to G2. We can't have this going unchecked." McLeod nodded. It was a concession. But the operational success of the day gave him leverage. He and his team returned to the sunken lane and oversaw the movement of the armored column. Evening brought the first clear aerial reconnaissance since D-Day. Pilots sent back photographs of the newly cleared lanes, the hedgerows broken, and the German defensive positions disrupted. McLeod compared them to his overlays. Every line matched. The sunken road, the drainage ditches, the gaps in the hedgerows. It was a proof of concept that could not be ignored. Meanwhile, morale among the troops improved. Soldiers joked about the ghost maps, guiding them. One sergeant whispered to his men, "It's like Colonel McLeod knows the land better than the Germans." In a rare moment of levity, McLeod allowed himself a smile, knowing that the soldiers' safety depended on that precise knowledge deemed illegal by the bureaucracy back in London. Late that night, in the cold and dripping Barnet Street, Sauveur-le-Vicomte, McLeod began updating his overlays with the latest photographic intelligence. He merged the new aerial reconnaissance with the cadastral maps, refining the positions of hedgerows, field paths, and drainage ditches. Each adjustment was carefully cross-referenced with artillery reports and forward observer notes. He also wrote detailed instructions for the next day, which tanks should follow which lanes, where engineers would need to cut new gaps, and how airstrikes could now bracket targets more effectively. His pencil moved methodically, outlining a network of micro-coordinates that would become indispensable to the breakout effort. The rain had stopped, leaving the barn filled with a cold, damp, quiet. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional crack of small arms reminded him that the war never paused, not even for planning. He rolled the overlays into tubes, stacking them neatly, and wrote a note to himself. Tomorrow, the bocage breaks. Rules be damned. McLeod lay back on a cot, listening to the wind through the shattered roof. He knew the use of these maps could be discovered at any moment, risking court-martial or worse. Yet the men on the front lines, the pilots, the tank crews, the infantry, would owe their lives to knowledge no one in the bureaucracy wanted them to have. In that cold, dim barn, McLeod understood that war was often less about legality and more about survival. By the end of June 21, the first genuine breakthrough through the bocage had been achieved. McLeod's overlays guided the armoured columns and coordinated air support with unprecedented precision. Word spread quietly among forward officers. Some called it genius, others called it reckless. For McLeod, it was simply necessary. The forbidden maps had turned the tide of the stalled advance, and though he would never report their use officially, every man who made it through the hedgerows that day carried the invisible imprint of his work. The Normandy breakout, still precarious and dangerous, had gained momentum one sunken lane, one hedge, one illegal line at a time. The dawn mist over Normandy was thinner now, the air carrying the scent of churned soil, burned timber, and the acrid tang of spent shells. Colonel McLeod surveyed the newly gained terrain from a slight rise outside the village of Carrington. Through binoculars, he could see the remnants of hedgerows flattened by tanks, infantry cautiously advancing, and the occasional plume of smoke marking a disrupted German position. Reports from forward observers arrived steadily. The overlays had guided the movement of armoured units with remarkable accuracy, but McLeod knew that the breakthrough was only partial. While the front was advancing, the flanks remained perilously exposed. The Germans, though shaken, had already begun reinforcing secondary positions along the approaches to Saint-Lô and Valognes. McLeod unrolled a fresh sheet of his composite overlays on the hood of a jeep. Each line, each hedgerow gap, and each sunken lane had been meticulously checked and corrected, using the latest reconnaissance photos from the RAF. He tapped a faint, almost invisible line that ran along the edge of a small copse of trees. "Here," he said to Lieutenant Albright, "we can advance without drawing heavy. Fire from the north. The Germans don't suspect this route, it's narrow, overlooked, and will let us swing around their main line." Albright hesitated. "Colonel, that lane hasn't been scouted. It's risky. The official maps show nothing but marshland." "That's exactly why it'll work," McLeod said, his voice calm but firm. "They'll think we're bogged down. We move silently, we flank them, and their strong points fall behind us instead of ahead." By mid-morning, McLeod's detachment, reinforced by engineers and reconnaissance squads, set off along the uncharted flank. The route was treacherous, shallow ditches hidden beneath overgrown brush, small streams cutting across the fields, and collapsed hedgerows that had to be cut manually. Yet the troops followed the paths laid out in McLeod's overlays with precision. Tanks with reinforced tracks moved cautiously, engineers marking every subtle depression in the terrain, and infantry maintaining a staggered formation to avoid bottlenecks. At 1030 hours, a small patrol of German infantry fired from a concealed position near a farmstead. McLeod, standing in the open to direct movement, ducked as a round tore through a nearby fence post. A forward observer radioed coordinates for artillery adjustment. Within minutes, the shellfire neutralized the German position without alerting the larger defensive line. "This is the first real test of the overlays beyond the main line," McLeod said quietly to Albright. "If this works, the flank will open, and the Germans will have no choice but to abandon their secondary positions." Albright glanced at the faint green lines on the overlay, still skeptical but beginning to see the practical value. As the day wore on, McLeod coordinated with RAF reconnaissance units to provide aerial oversight of the flank. Pilots flew low and slow, photographing each hedgerow, lane, and abandoned farm, sending instant updates back to McLeod's command post. The data was, cross-referenced with cadastral maps and previous overlays, ensuring that each lane led where it was intended. The German response was cautious but increasingly frantic. Radio intercepts, captured by McLeod's intelligence officer, indicated surprise. Units expected a stalled advance along the bocage, not an armoured column quietly flanking their positions. Mortars and machine guns began firing from multiple positions, but the American troops were already moving beyond their range. At 1,400 hours, McLeod directed the 1st Sherman platoon to pivot along a small embankment that led behind a German artillery battery. Using the hedgerow gaps marked in the overlay, they positioned themselves without being detected. Infantry crept forward, and within 20 minutes, the battery was silenced, the crews surrendering or fleeing into the woods. McLeod noted each position in his field notebook, marking successful maneuvers and the enemy's adjustments. By mid-afternoon, the American flanking maneuver had begun to ripple along the line. Reports from Saint-Lô indicated that German resistance was collapsing in sectors exposed by McLeod's overlay-guided advances. Sherman columns, previously pinned by invisible hedgerows and sunken lanes, were now moving in coordinated waves, supported by artillery that could bracket targets with unprecedented accuracy. McLeod received word from Colonel Harkins. The breakthrough had gained 5 kilometers in a single day along the northern flank. Harkins, ever cautious, still voiced concern about the unofficial maps. "Colonel, if G2 discovers the source of your routes, it could cause complications. But I'll admit, the flanking success is undeniable." McLeod simply nodded. He had no illusions about the bureaucratic risks. But he also understood that the lives saved and the momentum gained justified every illegal line drawn on the overlays. Late afternoon brought a lull, and McLeod took the opportunity to survey the terrain from a good vantage point overlooking the flank. The fields and hedgerows stretched like a patchwork quilt, and the smoke of destroyed German positions hung in the distance. He calculated that if his flanking route could be extended another 3 kilometers, the northern approach to Saint-Lô would be almost completely unguarded. He instructed the engineers to begin creating temporary lane markers and laid down coloured smoke grenades for orientation. These subtle cues, invisible from a distance, ensured that tanks and infantry would stay on course without exposing themselves to German observation. At dusk, McLeod convened a meeting with his forward observers and reconnaissance teams in a half-destroyed barn. He overlaid the latest reconnaissance photos with the cadastral maps, showing how small adjustments could maintain the element of surprise. "Tomorrow," he said, tracing a faint line along a sunken farm road, "we extend the flank. The Germans think the bocage still holds us. They won't expect a direct push through here. We move silently, we strike efficiently, and we preserve as many lives as possible." Night fell over the Normandy countryside, and the sounds of distant artillery fire and sporadic small-arms engagement became a background hum. McLeod returned to his cot in the barn, rolls of overlays at his side, field notebook open, and pencil in hand. He meticulously documented the day's movements, noting which hedgerows had been breached, which lanes proved passable, and how the German positions had shifted. He allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. In the chaos of the bocage, it was easy to forget that each lane, each sunken road, and each hedge gap represented live soldiers who could move safely because he had defied orders. The overlays, forbidden by G2, had become a lifeline in a landscape designed to kill slowly, relentlessly, and invisibly. The maps would remain secret. Only the troops on the ground and a handful of officers would ever know the truth of how the northern flank had been cleared. McLeod understood that history might never credit him for the maneuvers, but that mattered little. The breakout was progressing, momentum was building, and in the silent flank he had carved through the hedgerows, the war had shifted, one hidden lane at a time. The Vire River, swollen from weeks of rain, wound like a steel-blue serpent through the Normandy countryside. Its banks were steep, lined with tangled underbrush and the remnants of destroyed bridges. For weeks, Allied engineers had been struggling to find viable crossing points, while infantry units stalled under intermittent German artillery fire. Colonel McLeod stood on the western bank, binoculars pressed to his eyes, mentally tracing the overlay he had spent nights perfecting. He had already calculated every obstacle: sunken lanes, hedgerow gaps, narrow footbridges, and abandoned farm roads. Using captured cadastral surveys, he had identified a series of micro-terrain features invisible on the standard maps: small embankments, partially collapsed dikes, and even concealed fordable points. His illegal overlays now stretched across the map like a lattice of potential paths. Every line represented a possible route to outflank the German defensive positions east of the Wire. "Colonel, this is insane," Lieutenant Albright said, crouching beside him. "You want to move tanks and infantry through what looks like impassable marshland. Even the engineers said it's suicide." "Then let's make it less so," McLeod replied, voice calm, almost clinical. "The Germans expect a frontal crossing. They have artillery zeroed on the bridges. If we approach through the marshes and sunken lanes, they'll see nothing until we're on top of them. The overlays show the way." By 0600 hours, McLeod had assembled a mixed force of Sherman tanks, half-tracks, infantry squads, and engineers. Using faintly marked lanes and hedgerow gaps, they began the slow advance along the western approaches. Engineers carried portable fascines and bridging equipment, while infantry scouted ahead to clear small pockets of German resistance. Each movement was guided by the overlays, every path double-checked against the cadastral maps and the latest aerial reconnaissance. The initial crossing points were deceptively calm. Only a handful of German sentries, caught off guard by the unorthodox approach, raised an alarm before being neutralized. Tanks moved carefully through narrow dikes, their tracks churning mud and water, while infantry waded through knee-deep marshes, rifles held high to avoid snagging. McLeod noted the precise position of each unit, making slight adjustments in real time to avoid bogging down the columns. At 0930 hours, the 1st Sherman platoon reached a partially destroyed footbridge. Using portable bridging equipment, engineers constructed a temporary crossing within 20 minutes. The tanks began rolling over, their tracks leaving deep impressions in the soft soil, while infantry streamed behind them. The German artillery, aimed at the main bridges, never had the chance to target this new route. The Germans reacted swiftly once the flanking maneuver became evident. Machine gun nests hidden in farmhouses along the eastern bank opened fire, and mortars rained down sporadically. McLeod had anticipated these positions, and pre-coordinated artillery strikes suppressed the enemy emplacements. Observers on nearby ridges adjusted fire with almost surgical precision, using the overlays to estimate German locations that were otherwise obscured. Lieutenant Albright, moving alongside a Sherman column, whispered, "Colonel, I've never seen anything like this. Every step seems calculated, yet no one knew this route existed. How did you even find it?" McLeod's eyes scanned the distant tree line, calculating the next segment. Old cadastral surveys, aerial photos, and a lot of nights working alone. It's forbidden work, but it's effective. The Germans mapped Normandy perfectly before the war. We're just using their own data against them. By late morning, the entire brigade had crossed the initial Wire River points. McLeod directed follow-on elements to use secondary sunken lanes identified in the overlays. Tanks avoided patches of quicksand and hidden drainage ditches. Infantry used hedgerow gaps to conceal movements, and engineers marked safe passages for supply vehicles. The river crossing had become a coordinated ballet of precision movements, executed under constant threat, but guided by maps no one outside McLeod's small circle had seen. The German command, meanwhile, scrambled to reposition units along the eastern bank. Radio intercepts indicated confusion. Artillery units were firing at phantom targets. Infantry regiments were redeployed into non-existent lanes. And panic spread as they realized their presumed impassable terrain had been bypassed. McLeod noted each radio fragment, mentally adjusting the next phase of the flanking advance. At 1,330 hours, reconnaissance units spotted a German battery attempting to reposition northeast of Carentan. McLeod ordered an immediate artillery strike, combined with an infantry encirclement through a previously unused sunken lane. By 1500 hours, The battery was neutralized, and surviving crews were captured. McLeod marked the position on the overlay, verifying it against cadastral survey lines to prevent friendly fire incidents during follow-up advances. Even as the crossing succeeded, logistical challenges loomed. Supply vehicles struggled through narrow, mud-choked lanes, and engineers worked tirelessly to reinforce makeshift bridges. McLeod stayed on site, coordinating every detail with calm authority. Each movement followed the lines drawn in his overlays, paths invisible to traditional maps, but meticulously verified through reconnaissance and terrain analysis. By late afternoon, the breakthrough along the northern bank of the Via was undeniable. Infantry and armor units now threatened German positions east of St. Lo from unexpected directions. The official maps had predicted a stalemate. McLeod's overlays had turned the stagnation into momentum. Colonel Harkins, observing the crossing from a forward command post, radioed a rare message of praise. "McLeod, your illegal maps just saved St. Lo. I don't care what G2 thinks. Keep pushing." McLeod, unused to official commendation, simply nodded. The maps were not meant for recognition. They were a tool to save lives and achieve objectives. Yet, even as he acknowledged the message, he remained focused on the next phase, exploiting the breach before the Germans could recover. By nightfall, McLeod's forces had established a secure bridgehead east of the Vire. Engineers completed reinforcements on critical crossing points, infantry dug in along elevated terrain, and reconnaissance teams scouted deeper into the hedgerow-lined countryside. The Germans, now aware of the unconventional advance, began desperate counterattacks, but McLeod had already anticipated their likely routes. Artillery fire, pre-calculated using overlays, disrupted enemy formations before they could consolidate. Albright, exhausted but exhilarated, approached McLeod. "Colonel, we did it. The flank, the river, everything worked." McLeod allowed himself a brief smile. "Yes. And tomorrow, we take the next ridge. The Germans think we're done. They don't know the maps exist. The overlays, hidden beneath the cot in the barn, remained a secret weapon. Each line represented not only strategy but lives preserved, obstacles overcome, and momentum gained. The Vire River, once seen as a natural barrier, had become a corridor of opportunity transformed by a single officer's meticulous, illegal study of terrain and human ingenuity. As darkness settled over Normandy, McLeod made final notes in his field notebook. Towards St. Lo would continue. The breakout was no longer a hope. It was in motion, guided by hidden lines that would never appear on official maps, yet whose impact would echo across the bocage for weeks to come. The town of St. Lo lay shrouded in morning fog, its spired church rising like a phantom above the low rooftops. For weeks, Allied commanders had expected the bocage and river systems to slow the advance into this strategic crossroads. Yet Colonel McLeod's forces, moving along routes invisible on official maps, had arrived on the outskirts almost silently. The town's defenders, entrenched in buildings, sunken lanes, and fortified farmsteads, had little warning of the approach. McLeod, atop a ridge overlooking the eastern edge of St. Lo, studied his overlays once more. The cadastral lines, painstakingly merged with aerial photographs, revealed patterns invisible to standard reconnaissance. Narrow alleys connecting courtyards, collapsed walls forming hidden passages, and hedgerows that could shield infantry movements. Each detail was critical for the coming assault. "Colonel, artillery reports indicate multiple MG nests along Rue de la Gare," Lieutenant Albright said, pointing to the map spread across the hood of a jeep. "They'll tear the lead platoon apart if we go in directly." McLeod tapped the overlay lightly. "We won't go in directly. Use the sunken lanes along the northern perimeter. Infantry screens first. Armor follows. Artillery suppresses anything we can't see. But avoid firing near civilian structures. We want the town intact for logistical purposes." The first squads moved out at 0600 hours. Silent as ghosts, they slipped along the lanes McLeod had highlighted, wading through mud, ducking under broken hedges, and keeping low under fragmented tree cover. McLeod followed with a forward observation team, coordinating artillery strikes on concealed German positions. Each attack was carefully measured. Too heavy, and the town's infrastructure would crumble. Too light, and the defenders might regroup. By 0800 hours, McLeod's infantry had reached the town's northern edge. German fire became sporadic but increasingly intense as defenders scrambled to respond to attacks from unexpected directions. McLeod noted each engagement, marking positions on his overlay. Every house with a red dot, he instructed, is a potential threat. Keep the momentum. A Sherman platoon, guided by McLeod's clandestine lanes, began rolling through the northern alleys. Tanks scraped past stone walls and partially collapsed barns, their tracks leaving deep impressions in the mud but avoiding hidden pitfalls marked on the overlay. Infantry moved in tandem, rifles ready, using doorways and windows as temporary cover. German defenders were caught between frontal artillery and flanking maneuvers, unable to anticipate attacks from angles invisible on standard maps. At 1030 hours, reconnaissance reported a German counterattack forming from the southeast. McLeod calculated the approach using his overlays. The enemy would be funneled through narrow streets, unable to deploy armor effectively. Prepare the crossfire, he ordered. Infantry on the buildings, tanks on Rue St. Nicholas. We wait for them to enter the funnel. The first German half-tracks entered the designated streets, only to be met with coordinated fire from multiple angles. Tanks and infantry, positioned according to McLeod's illegal maps, destroyed the vehicles within minutes. Surviving soldiers were captured in small groups, unable to escape through the hedgerows or sunken lanes McLeod had already secured. As afternoon descended, McLeod shifted focus to securing key logistical points. The main bridge over the Vera had been sabotaged but remained partially intact. Engineers, guided by McLeod's overlays, reinforced the structure and prepared a temporary crossing for supply vehicles. Meanwhile, infantry cleared the northern and western sectors of the town, systematically sweeping houses, cellars, and courtyards. The cadastral maps were invaluable. McLeod could identify hidden courtyards that connected to major streets, anticipate trapdoors and basements, and even locate wells used as defensive positions. Every prediction proved accurate. Every step minimized unnecessary casualties. By 1600 hours, McLeod's forces controlled nearly half of Saint-Lô, with German resistance concentrated in scattered pockets around the southern and eastern sectors. Despite the tactical success, McLeod faced bureaucratic pressure. G2 headquarters, noticing irregular troop movements and unrecorded routes on official maps, demanded explanations. McLeod's operations officer, Captain Jensen, brought a terse radio from Division HQ. Colonel, we have inquiries about unapproved maneuvers. Your routes aren't on any recognized maps. Command wants clarification. McLeod exhaled slowly. He knew full well the risk. His overlays were classified as forbidden intelligence. Admitting their existence could trigger court-martial or at least an investigation. Yet hesitation could cost the town and hundreds of soldiers' lives. Reply that the maneuvers are within operational discretion, McLeod instructed. Do not mention the overlays. Focus on terrain advantage, reconnaissance, and enemy unpredictability. We need time, not paperwork. As evening fell, McLeod prepared the final phase. The southern push toward the heart of Saint-Lô. Using hidden alleys and sunken lanes identified on the cadastral maps, infantry moved quietly to encircle remaining German defenders. Artillery fire remained precise, only targeting confirmed positions to prevent collateral damage. McLeod noted each engagement in his field notebook, recording which lanes had been cleared and which required additional sweeps. By 2200 hours, the town was largely under Allied control. German survivors were scattered, some surrendering, others retreating into the countryside. The southern sector, previously considered a death trap by division planners, had been secured with minimal casualties, thanks entirely to the previously forbidden overlays. McLeod walked through the streets, observing soldiers cleaning rifles and checking equipment. Mud-streaked faces reflected relief and exhaustion. Lieutenant Albright approached, hands trembling slightly from adrenaline. "Colonel, we've taken St. Lo. Entirely. Your maps, they saved lives. Do you think command will ever know?" McLeod shook his head. "They may know something unusual happened, but they won't know why. The maps stay hidden. For now, our concern is the next objective: securing supply lines and preparing for the breakout beyond the Via." As night settled over the town, McLeod returned to a small command post in a commandeered schoolhouse. He spread the overlays across a table, reviewing every path, bridge, and sunken lane. Future operations would build on this framework. Every success, every avoided ambush, had been guided by the illegal work that G2 had forbidden. Yet it was clear, without these overlays, St. Lo might still have been a bloody stalemate. McLeod made final annotations, marking the most effective routes for follow-on units and noting areas needing reinforcement. Outside, soldiers slept in the streets, tents, and barns, unaware that the invisible lines on the maps above them had dictated their survival. By midnight, Colonel McLeod leaned back, exhausted but resolute. The breakout from Normandy was underway, and his clandestine maps had just turned the tide in one of the theatre's most critical towns. The risk of exposure remained, but in the calculus of war, victory and lives saved justified the gamble. The dawn over Normandy was pale and mist-laden, with the rising sun casting a grey wash across fields still scarred by shellfire. Beyond St. Lo, the Via River meandered through the bocage, a natural barrier that the Germans had expected would stall the Allied advance for weeks. Yet Colonel McLeod's forces, guided by the forbidden cadastral overlays, were preparing to cross. Moving along routes unseen on official maps, McLeod surveyed the landscape from a ridge overlooking the river. Engineers were already testing points for pontoon bridges, while reconnaissance squads probed the enemy lines. German troops were well entrenched along the riverbanks, with machine gun nests, artillery emplacements, and mined approaches. Standard intelligence predicted a 2-day slog with heavy casualties, but McLeod had alternative plans. "Captain Jensen, have the engineers focus on the western crossing points," McLeod ordered, tracing a hidden stream on the overlay that connected to a disused mill road. "The Germans won't expect an approach here. Infantry first, armour follows once the pontoon is secure. Keep it quiet, no artillery unless absolutely necessary." Jensen nodded, the weight of responsibility evident in his expression. "Sir, you're asking them to cross in plain sight of enemy positions without cover. It's risky. It's risk versus certainty," McLeod replied. "Our maps show the approach is covered by hedgerows and sunken lanes that aren't on their reconnaissance charts. The enemy thinks these are impassable. That miscalculation is our advantage." The first platoons moved at 0500 hours. Soldiers waded through narrow drainage ditches and slipped along hedgerows, avoiding open fields that had been noted as potential kill zones in the overlays. Artillery observers stayed hidden, providing real-time updates to suppress German positions only if they became a threat. The coordination between infantry, armour, and engineers was precise. Each movement calculated on routes invisible to higher headquarters, but clearly delineated in McLeod's maps. A German patrol, expecting an approach from the main road, stumbled upon a detachment moving along the mill track. The result was brief but chaotic skirmishing. The patrol was quickly neutralized with minimal noise, and the main crossing remained undetected. McLeod marked the site on his overlay, noting enemy tendencies and expected reinforcement patterns. By mid-morning, engineers began assembling pontoons at the western crossing. The river, swollen from recent rains, threatened to wash away hastily laid structures, but McLeod's advanced knowledge of hidden fording points allowed them to anchor pontoons securely. Infantry moved across in small units, using natural cover along the banks to avoid enemy observation. The overlay had revealed subtle bends and depressions in the terrain, small details that made the difference between a deadly exposure and safe passage. German observers, expecting a frontal assault, were slow to react. McLeod anticipated countermeasures, positioning rifle teams and tanks to cover potential reinforcement paths. When artillery finally opened from the eastern bank, the shells fell short or overshot, thanks to the carefully chosen crossing points and terrain masking. McLeod's intelligence-driven gamble was paying off, as entire platoons made the crossing without the predicted catastrophic losses. By 1300 hours, the main body of McLeod's regiment had crossed the Via. Engineers dismantled pontoon sections to prevent pursuit, leaving only narrow, hidden lanes for any potential German counterattack. Infantry began clearing the western bank, systematically removing snipers and small pockets of resistance. The cadastral maps were again invaluable, showing building layouts, alleyways, and drainage ditches that could conceal enemy positions. Every anticipated threat was accounted for, and every engagement favored the Allies. Supply lines became the next priority. Trucks and jeeps carrying ammunition, rations, and medical supplies were funneled along concealed routes, avoiding main roads where German artillery observers could detect movement. McLeod personally inspected these lanes, ensuring that the vehicles could pass without exposure. At one point, he discovered a hidden ditch marked on the overlay as a drainage channel. A truck had nearly tipped into it. Quick adjustments saved both the vehicle and the cargo. As afternoon progressed, German reinforcements began to arrive from the south. McLeod had predicted this pattern, having studied intercepted communications and post-capture intelligence. He ordered a series of ambushes along narrow lanes that led to the riverbank, using infantry and tank pairs to hold choke points. The enemy's advance slowed dramatically, and casualties were higher than expected on their side. Meanwhile, Colonel McLeod continued his meticulous notes in a field notebook, documenting positions, timing of movements, and effectiveness of maneuvers. Every detail would be crucial for subsequent operations, particularly the breakout toward Coutances and the eventual push to Avranches. Nightfall brought new challenges. The riverbanks were illuminated only by starlight and occasional flares, making navigation difficult. McLeod ordered units to halt, consolidating positions and fortifying temporary strongpoints. Soldiers dug into hedgerows, reinforcing natural cover with sandbags and timber from nearby ruins. The overlays revealed micro-terrain advantages. Depressions that offered concealment, hedgerows wide enough to provide firing positions, and intersecting paths that could serve as escape routes if needed. During a brief lull, McLeod convened his officers. Tomorrow, we push inland towards Saint-Georges and Coutances. The enemy will expect movement along main roads. We will move along hidden lanes and hedgerows. Keep communication tight and minimize exposure. Casualties are low so far because we've exploited terrain they cannot anticipate. That advantage ends if we become predictable. Lieutenant Albright, map spread before him, pointed to a series of faint lines. Sir, these lanes are only visible on your overlays. If we follow them, we bypass at least 3 fortified positions entirely. Exactly, McLeod replied. This is why the maps were forbidden. They show details too precise for the standard operational doctrine. Use them wisely, and we save lives while advancing. Misuse them, and the risk of exposure is fatal. The final hours of the day were spent reinforcing positions and preparing for the next morning's advance. Engineers repaired minor damage to roads, infantry dug additional foxholes, and signal teams laid wire along concealed lanes for reliable communication. McLeod walked the lines quietly, observing soldiers cleaning weapons and resting in ditches. Despite exhaustion, morale remained high. Saint-Lô had fallen, and the Vire crossing had succeeded against expectations. As he returned to his command post, McLeod reflected on the risks he had taken. Using forbidden cadastral maps was illegal, yes, but the tactical advantage had been undeniable. Without these overlays, Saint-Lô might have been a protracted battle, and the Vire River could have stalled the breakout for weeks. Instead, precision, foresight, and audacity had turned the tide. By midnight, McLeod updated his master overlay with new observations from the crossing. Every lane, culvert, and sunken path had been annotated for future reference. Tomorrow, The push toward Coutances would test these strategies further, but for now, the breakout beyond the Vera had been achieved with minimal losses. The maps remained a closely guarded secret, their forbidden details the key to victory in Normandy. The morning fog over Coutances was thick, muting the sounds of artillery and the low hum of engines. McLeod's regiment advanced along the concealed lanes highlighted on his forbidden overlays, moving in compact units to avoid detection. German forces, expecting a frontal assault along the main highway, were caught off guard. Infantry scouted ahead, signaling positions of machine gun nests and hidden mortar teams. McLeod's overlays revealed subtle depressions and side lanes that bypassed these strong points entirely. Tanks followed in staggered intervals, using hedgerows for cover. Occasionally, bursts of small arms fire echoed through the fog. But casualties were minimal, a stark contrast to predicted losses if they had relied on official maps. At 0900 hours, a German counterattack emerged from the east, attempting to retake a strategic crossroads. McLeod had anticipated this and prepared a layered defense. Anti-tank teams and infantry ambushes were positioned along concealed lanes, effectively channeling the enemy into kill zones. Within 20 minutes, the German advance faltered, leaving the survivors disorganized and demoralized. By midday, Coutances itself was in reach. McLeod coordinated with artillery units, providing precise targeting information from his overlays. Rather than blind bombardment, the fire was surgical, neutralizing fortified positions while minimizing civilian casualties. Infantry entered the town through hidden alleys, capturing buildings systematically. By evening, Coutances fell with remarkably low Allied losses. McLeod surveyed the town from a ridge to the south, noting how the overlays had allowed him to outmaneuver the enemy, maintain the initiative, and protect his men. His maps, once forbidden, had turned into the linchpin of the Normandy breakout, transforming a potentially prolonged and bloody battle into a swift and decisive advance. The early July sun rose over the Norman countryside, casting long shadows across the patchwork of fields and hedgerows that had defined the battles of the past 3 weeks. McLeod's men, though fatigued, moved with a precision born of meticulous planning. The forbidden overlays that had guided them through Coutances and beyond were now indispensable instruments of strategy. Every valley, sunken, lane, and hidden defile marked in their margins offered insight the official maps could not. McLeod convened with his regimental commanders before dawn. A breakthrough at Avranches would open the path into Brittany and force the German 7th Army into a retreat or encirclement. The town, perched at the junction of multiple routes and rail lines, was heavily defended. Reports indicated German reinforcements moving north from Mortagne and west from Falaise, a potential trap McLeod intended to avoid. "The terrain is against us if we follow the main roads," McLeod said, spreading the overlays across the makeshift table. "But these side lanes here and here," he traced the lines with a finger, "they allow us to bypass their strongest positions, hit them from unexpected angles, and secure the high ground south of the town." His aides exchanged uneasy glances. Following illegal maps was one thing. Committing an entire regiment to them in full-scale combat was another. Yet McLeod's track record in Normandy gave his men confidence. Every mile gained, every hedgerow traversed without casualties, validated the risk. The advance began at 0430 hours under the cover of mist. Infantry units moved silently through narrow lanes, supported by tanks navigating routes invisible to aerial reconnaissance. McLeod's overlays provided alternative paths around minefields and artillery zones, allowing the armoured units to avoid predictable choke points. Recon teams signalled German positions and pre-registered artillery coordinates, calculated from the overlays, struck with deadly accuracy. By mid-morning, the first elements reached the high ground overlooking Avranches. German observers scrambled to relay warnings, but communications were chaotic, disrupted by continuous Allied artillery and air attacks. McLeod coordinated with the 339th Fighter Squadron, who executed low-level strafing runs based on the overlay's micro-terrain data. The planes avoided predictable flight paths, striking German positions with precision and retreating before anti-aircraft guns could react. The town itself proved more resilient than anticipated. Streets were barricaded, and German troops had established strongpoints in key buildings. McLeod divided his forces into small, coordinated assault teams. Guided by his overlays, they avoided the most heavily defended avenues, attacking from unexpected angles and isolating enemy positions. Houses that had been considered indefensible on standard maps became critical staging points, thanks to the hidden courtyards and narrow lanes documented in the captured cadastral surveys. By early afternoon, German resistance began to crumble. McLeod personally supervised a crossing of the Sélune River, a maneuver deemed too risky on official maps. The overlays revealed a shallow ford and concealed paths along the banks, allowing engineers to construct temporary bridges and move tanks across without detection. This maneuver encircled German forces, cutting off their retreat toward the west. Reports from the front confirmed the breakthrough. Enemy units were surrendering in small groups, their morale shattered by the precision of the Allied advance. McLeod's regimental signals officer noted, "Positions taken exactly as predicted by overlays. No losses where alternative lanes were used. Casualties minimal compared to initial forecasts." As dusk fell, McLeod stood atop a ridge south of Avranches, overlooking the town now under Allied control. Smoke rose from a handful of German strongpoints still burning, but the breakthrough was complete. The forbidden maps had proven their worth beyond any doubt. McLeod allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The audacity of using captured German cadastral surveys, the long nights merging them with aerial reconnaissance, and the calculated disregard for G2 orders had all converged into a decisive victory. In the days following, the Avranches breakthrough reshaped the Normandy campaign. German forces were forced into a rapid retreat toward the Seine, and the door to Brittany opened, allowing Allied armoured divisions to advance unopposed along critical supply routes. Post-war analyses would attribute the success to superior planning and intelligence, often omitting McLeod's illegal map trick. Few realized that the combination of audacity, meticulous attention to detail, and the courage to defy bureaucratic restrictions had transformed a potential stalemate into a turning point in the campaign. McLeod's officers, who had once questioned the legality of the overlays, now praised their accuracy. The men in the field understood, in stark contrast to the paper-bound regulations, that knowledge of the terrain could be the difference between life and death. As the regiment consolidated its positions south of Avranches, McLeod sent word to headquarters, noting, "We hold the town intact, enemy forces scattered, and casualties minimal. Maps used under my discretion. Recommend review of their potential for wider operations." Though the message would be met with bureaucratic caution, the tactical success was undeniable. The Normandy breakout owed much to ingenuity, but even more to the courage of one colonel willing to bend the rules in the service of his men and the mission. By the 9th of July 1944, the Avranches breakthrough had etched itself into operational history, a testament to the power of precise information, bold leadership, and the quiet defiance of an officer who knew that maps, however forbidden, could save lives.